Well, good afternoon, everyone. The strength of our democracy depends upon clear lines between politics and law enforcement, between intelligence and criminal investigations, and most importantly, between the White House and the ballot box. What happened in Georgia last week erased those lines that are simply unacceptable. And this is even a more heightened concern after the President's comments last night. And let me be clear about why this matters. Regardless of what had been stated, this is not about the 2020 election. That election has been litigated, audited, recounted, and repeatedly upheld by courts and election officials, including lots and lots of Republican election officials. This is frankly about what comes next. It is deeply alarming that just yesterday the President called for Republicans, his words, to take over and nationalize voting in multiple states. That statement alone makes clear that this threat to our election security, the basic premise of our democracy, is forward-looking to 2026, into 2028, and candidly to the institutions that safeguard our democracy. This is about whether these same tactics we're seeing now, or worse, will be used to disrupt free and fair elections. One of the reasons why, as we think about ICE reform, the notion of roving ICE patrols parading around election polling stations is a very real and legitimate concern. And truthfully, as we've seen, whether the very institutions meant to protect our democracy will be misused to upheaval. So let's be clear. It is inappropriate for a sitting president to personally involve himself in a criminal investigation tied to an election he lost. It is inappropriate for the president to advocate for actions that are wholly at odds with the Constitution and 2.5 centuries of state and local elections. It is inappropriate for the Director of National Intelligence to insert herself into a domestic law enforcement operation far outside her statutory role. And it is profoundly inappropriate for either of them to blur the lines between intelligence, law enforcement, and partisan politics. But that is exactly what happened last week in Fulton County. As Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I want to underscore a core legal boundary. U.S. intelligence agencies are structured to operate overseas, not on domestic soil. The National Security Act and other laws exist precisely to prevent election officials or intelligence officials from surveilling or intervening in domestic political matters. I may be the only one, well, maybe somebody else is old enough to remember that a lot of this came about because of actions of the Nixon administration back in the 60s. Those actions that literally resulted in the creation of the Oversight Committee that I now sit as chair and now vice chair. Because we know when intelligence personnel are inserted into domestic criminal investigation, especially one launched under such a thin veil of legitimacy, it raises serious legal and constitutional questions and politicizes an institution that must remain neutral and apolitical. The Director of National Intelligence does not conduct criminal investigations. She has no role in executing search warrants, and she does not belong on the scene of a domestic FBI search, particularly one tied to the President's personal grievances carried out under the pretense of normal law enforcement. Now, Director Gabbard argues that her presence was justified by, quote, broad statutory authority. But broad authority to analyze intelligence is not a license to participate in a sham investigation. And it certainly does not justify facilitating direct contact between the frontline FBI agents doing this investigation directly to the President of the United States. That phone call alone should concern every American, because it didn't occur in a vacuum. Now, if this administration were genuinely committed to election security, its actions would reflect that. Instead, we have seen the absolute opposite, the systemic weakening of the very institutions designed to protect our elections from real threats. And remarkably, many of these organizations and entities were put in place under the first Trump administration. So what have they done? The administration disbanded the FBI's Foreign Intelligence Task Force, the unit created in 2017 to investigate foreign interference, share intelligence across agencies, and work with the private sector to close cyber vulnerabilities. It has gutted enforcement of the Foreign Agents Registration Act, FARA, which exists to expose covert foreign influence in our political system. It dismantled the Office of the Director of National Intelligence's own Foreign Malign Influence Center, a center created by law. This is not an option for Tulsi Gabbard to dismiss. This center was created by law to track and document state-sponsored threats to our elections and candidates, and do so with transparency designed to make sure politics stays out of its work. And it has slashed the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA's, election security workforce, cutting more than a third of the agency and ending funding for programs that provided direct cybersecurity support to state and local elections. These are not the actions of an administration that's serious about election security. These are the actions of an administration clearing away safeguards while simultaneously inserting itself into domestic investigations, seizing election materials, as they did in Georgia, and publicly calling for Republicans, again, to take over and nationalize voting in multiple states. When you put all of this together, it is clear that what happened in Fulton County is not about revisiting the past. It is about shaping the outcome of future elections. And quite honestly, dismantling the very guardrails that were put in place to keep them free and fair. This is why it cannot be brushed aside with carefully worded letters from Director Gabbard. She owes Congress, and more important, the American people, direct answers. So once again, I'm calling on the Director of National Intelligence to appear in person before the Senate Intelligence Committee to testify under oath about her role in this matter. She needs to explain why she believed it was appropriate to involve herself in a domestic criminal investigation, why she facilitated direct contact between the President and FBI agents on the ground, and what safeguards, if any, were put in place to protect against direct political interference. Now, we all know that Americans deserve free elections, safe from political intimidation. They deserve a justice system that operates independently, and they deserve accountability when those very safeguards are put at risk. As Vice Chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee, I'm going to use every tool I can to make sure that we get those answers. And before I take questions, I remember back, a year ago at this time when people would often ask me when they were seeing the actions of the Trump administration, do you think we'll have free and fair elections in 26 or in 28? And my response at that point was, I think you're overreacting. I have deep concerns about the fairness of our elections in 26 and 28 right now. I have concerns about the elections in primaries in our country. I have concerns about the elections that may take place in Virginia in terms of a redistricting referendum. These kind of actions that have taken place over the last year, as we've seen the systemic dismantling of the very protections that were put in place by, again, the first Trump administration, If it doesn't scare the heck out of you, it should. And then, if you go back to the report, the Bipartisan Intelligence Committee investigation report into the 2016 interference, unanimously agreed to by including the Secretary of State and all of the members of the committee, it said one of the strongest protections we had about interference in our election system was the fact of our decentralization, that we have these elections carried out as laid out in the Constitution by states and localities. The idea that now Donald Trump wants to nationalize these elections and have one political party take over that process, this provides a huge danger to our country going forward and the safety and security of these elections. So I'd be happy to take your questions.
Senator, given the President's comments on the podcast and the events in Georgia, have you heard about this effort spreading to other states? Are you concerned?
I'm deeply concerned.